Hi, welcome to this talk about the Oxford Cognitive Screen. My name is Nele de Meijere. I'm an associate professor in psychology and I am the academic lead on all things OCS, Oxford Cognitive Screen. It goes by all three, it seems. So, the specific learning objectives for this session is to have a think about why you might want to use the Oxford Cognitive Screen. And I'll give you obviously some ideas about why we think it's a good idea and why it fits and how it fits in the bigger picture of assessing cognitive problems post-stroke. And next we're going to cover briefly what the guiding principles are, so you understand a little bit more about the background and how it was set up. And then finally the specific OCS subtests, how they're organized, what each of them is assessing, basically giving you that overview. Okay, so why might you use the Oxford Cognitive Screen? In line with what you've already been hearing about in previous sessions on the importance of looking for cognitive deficits post-stroke and understanding how that impacts people, and particularly also in the long term, if we just look at the guidelines and look at what is good clinical practice, most guidelines will recommend that you should assess cognition post-stroke. This is a nice guideline from the UK, which is our National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, where it was stated already quite early on to specifically note that you should include cognition in your assessment of the person who's just had a stroke. And that includes quite explicitly separate domains. So please look at attention, memory, spatial awareness, apraxia, and perception. This was followed up by a more recent guideline in 2016 from the Royal College of Physicians, their national clinical guidelines for stroke, where it again was clear that different cognitive domains may be affected, but importantly, we should look at these cognitive domains not in isolation, but look at them together because most everyday activities draw on a range of abilities. So, what was actually going on for a long time, and maybe still is going on in a lot of places, is that there is no clear solution, right? And if you ask neuropsychologists to do domain-specific assessments, there are many existing neuropsychological batteries specifically looking at language, specifically looking at attention, and so on. But each of those often takes up to an hour to complete, and that's just not practical. Not on the side of patient burden, who may not be able to sustain that kind of level of paying attention and concentration, especially early on after a stroke, but also not in terms of level of staff availability. It's not feasible for every stroke survivor to be seen by a trained clinical neuropsychologist who can run through all of these neuropsychological batteries. So both aspects mean that that's just not practical. On the other hand, we have the short screening tools, which are feasible, which are practical, and which is typically what happens on your average stroke unit. So what these screening tools do is they give you a brief look. They can usually be done in 15 to 20 minutes and give you an assessment of cognition. They were typically made for dementia, and the emphasis on many of these cognitive screening tools is on verbal memory, because that would be the domain that you would be looking for to assess given a potential Alzheimer's dementia, for example. Importantly, none of those tools were made for stroke. So in the end, what you get from these screening tools is this very broad pass-fail of cognition. It gives you a single number overall, which is then okay or not okay. And that may be okay if you're specifically looking, say, for an Alzheimer's dementia, but within stroke, you would ask, what about cognition is impaired? What domain is the problem? So if we take one of the examples, that's probably the most well-known currently, the MOCA, what you see is that although there are specific subsections, so there is a section on visual spatial and there is a section on naming, in the end this is still very much a dementia screen, and that kind of cognitive profile is very different from a stroke cognitive profile. And although it has these subsections, There's no normative data for each of those subsections separately. You can only do an overall score and then an overall impaired, not impaired decision. Other than that, there's a real issue with these stroke-specific factors, like, for example, neglect. That top left corner is probably the worst possible location for a test to be put for any patient who's got left-sided visual spatial neglect, which is, as we all know, highly common in stroke. So patients here, for example, will then fail this task, not because they can't do trail making, but simply because it's on a crowded page, it's on the very left, they probably won't see the 5 and the D. So there's contamination of things like neglect on a busy page like this, and is heavily language dependent. So for any patient with an expressive language problem, be that word finding or on the severe end, a complete expressive aphasia where they have no spoken words, the most you can get on this test is a 5. So you'll automatically be deemed impaired, not because you have dementia, but because you have aphasia. So this is where the OCS was born. It's really to try and bridge these two kind of aspects. We have these broad global screens which are feasible, which are being used in medical research all the time, but which are made for dementia. And then on the other side, we have detailed domain-specific assessment batteries and all the neuropsychology expertise that goes with it. And somewhere in the middle, we want to bring in that neuropsychology expertise and make a short screen, and that's when the OCS was born. So there's a few more reasons why you may want to consider domain-specific screening. One quite obvious one, but maybe harder to pinpoint, is this potential mislabeling as a patient having dementia. This often happens because of the nature of these global screens being known as dementia screens. Patients will be put in their notes that they may have a dementia. That dementia may not be on a declining profile, but most people inherently will assume that this is a decline, because once that label has been put on you, you don't really think, oh, it's just a cognitive impairment. People will think, okay, this is the start of a declining slope. So with domain-specific screening, you get a much clearer overview of the cognitive profile. Remember those guidelines, try and not look at those domains in isolation, but understand where the strengths and weaknesses are. It can be used to guide therapy, knowing where someone's strengths and weaknesses are. Say someone has spatial inattention, say someone has an apraxia, can allow you to guide therapy decisions and allow to guide more broader decisions about care pathway, destinations of discharge and care packages. And then finally, it can measure both recovery as well as decline. And you're looking at these specific domain tasks and these specific domain impairments. So for example, this is from a paper we published in 2016 in Journal of Neurology, where we had 200 stroke survivors who completed both the OCS and the MOCA. And you can see this is just impairment incidence for different subtasks of the OCS and then for the MOCA overall. And what you can see is there's really high prevalence of these kind of impairments. So what you see here in bold, I'm not sure if you see my mouse hovering here, but these kind of bold tasks are tasks that are not being assessed in dementia screens. So things like visual fields, spatial neglect, apraxia, reading and writing are all things that are supposed to be okay, right? When you test someone from dementia, you don't expect them not to be able to read, for example. You expect that they are okay reading, but actually, unless you look for it, here we found, for example, 26% of our patients that we saw had an impairment in reading. In that same paper, we also looked at, within those 200 patients, where the MOCA was deemed okay. So, you know, there's different ways of defining okay, but in this case, we went okay with a score higher than 25, so 26 and over. And then looked at, you know, these people who would be deemed cognition okay, what do they look like on the OCS? And half of those patients, for example, had spatial neglect. Quite a lot of them had more subtle executive impairments, had reading, writing problems, and so on. Okay, so hoping that you can see perhaps why we might need to do domain-specific screening. I'll tell you a little bit more about the OCS itself and what the guiding principles are in the brief screen. So it's very much aligned to these guidelines, although they came out after the OCS was developed. This kind of idea of looking at cognitive domains not in isolation fits very clearly with how the OCS was developed, because this is the profile you get at the end. So we've chosen to go with this kind of visual snapshot report, so you can see those different domains, and the idea is that people cross out the areas that are impaired and leaving open the areas that are okay. And basically what it gives you is, at a glance, a quick profile looking at these different domains together and where the strengths and weaknesses are. So the 5 domains that are included in the OCS are language, attention, memory, praxis, and number abilities. So the test philosophy for the OCS is very much to make something brief and interactive. As I said, we're trying to bridge that gap and take the feasibility of these brief screens that we need in acute stroke, where you can't do lengthy assessments, but also for it to be interactive, not just a sit down and be examined and ask question, here's something for you to do, could you have a look at this, let's make something together. So something a little bit more interactive than just this list of questions to answer. Similar as to what I was saying with the profile, it's not just about showing where people have impairments, it's also about showing where they have strengths, and that can be a really gratifying experience, especially, for example, in patients who've got an aphasia. Often they're not being assessed or tested at all because they're assumed to be, likely to fail, they won't understand, they can't do these tests, can't assess cognition because they have a language problem. But actually, when you start testing with the OCS, you'll find that a lot of the tasks they can do, and often they are extremely proud to show you that yes, they can still do that. And even things like sometimes the number abilities, which although linked to language can exist on their own, and for them to be able to show that, look, I can do this, it's a really nice feeling both for the examiner and for the patient to kind of be aware that there are still things that they're very good at as well. The test incorporates several measures, and this is kind of to maximize time efficiency. And because it's a screen, what we're trying to do is get as much information in as short a space as possible. We're also very much trying to use tests that are sensitive, so that means that they will detect a problem if a problem is present, and indicate a general domain deficit. So when we do, for example, picture naming, we can see that there's a problem in picture naming, but the screen will not go into the specifics and in-depth assessment of what that exact problem then is. That's for a full assessment. That's not part of screening in our view. So further test philosophy, as I kind of hinted at when I gave you the example of neglect confounds and aphasia confounds, is that we really try to minimize these potential confounders as much as possible. We use simple vertical layouts, we use multimodal presentations, and we're very much not trying to double penalize people. So if they can't do something for one particular reason, you shouldn't then again penalize them on another thing that actually depends on the first error being made. We also really want to maximize understanding and participation and be as inclusive as possible. So that means that we really aimed very hard to make this test as feasible as possible for people with aphasia by using some very short, high-frequency words, by using multimodal presentations, but also by incorporating demonstration and practice, so that even if the language explanation is perhaps difficult to understand or comprehend and abstract, just by showing and having a practice run, we're trying to incorporate this increased understanding and maximize participation. So the key take-home messages is that it was made for stroke. It's very much stroke specific. It was made to be aphasia friendly, and it was made to be neglect friendly, and assess different domains of cognition. So when we talk about stroke specific, it means as I've hinted at before when I gave you the overview of impairments, we want to pick up things like neglect. This is a highly common problem within stroke, and it's something we want to be screening for. So in the assessment, Within the OCS, you actually get 2 levels of neglect. So I'll briefly explain here, but there'll be more detailed explanations later. Basically, we're trying to get egocentric or space-based neglect. This is with reference to your own midline, you know, what are you missing on one side versus the other side. But also we're trying to get at object-centered neglect or allocentric neglect. And what happens here is the task is to cross out the full hearts. And you see quite a lot actually, it's quite a frequent impairment where people consistently cross out hearts with gaps on one side. So what's happening here is that within the object itself, they're ignoring one part of the object, and so for them it looks like a whole heart, so it looks like a target and it's being crossed out. And this can happen where they cross out all over the page but specifically keep making these object-centered neglect errors. Other tasks are specific to stroke, looking for apraxia in simple imitation. So there's a hand sequence, for example this, and then this, and the patient has to copy the gesture. So this is not about detecting motor weakness, this is about motor planning and understanding whether patients are able to cognitively plan specific sequences and actions in a copying task. It's also very much made to be inclusive. For example, one of the tasks is an incidental memory task. So it's asking about what you've done before and what you've seen before, and you can just point to it. You don't need to have any language awareness to be able to do this kind of memory task. So if we look at all the specific tasks in the wheel, and we'll go over them in a bit more detail in a bit, what you can see is that except for the domain where we're really trying to assess language, all the other tasks can be done without spoken language. Similarly, except for the task where we're specifically trying to assess neglect, all the other tasks are designed so as to be as least confounded as possible by neglect. And that's not rocket science, that's just by simply having non-crowded displays, large letters, nicely centered in the middle. So in sum, the OCS takes about 15 to 20 minutes to administer. So within most frameworks, that's usually one, say, OT session that you can do and you can complete the OCS in. So it's brief enough to be done on the bedside with patients who've got recently have had their stroke and who have perhaps issues concentrating for longer. We've also done them while patients have still been bedbound and have not been able to sit up. It takes a little bit of juggling with your paperwork, but it is completely doable and it's being done all the time. So then the other take-home messages is that this test has been norm-validated and published. The way it's been set up is that the licensing system we have in place is to make sure it remains free for publicly funded clinical use and research use. If that is not you or your setting, please do contact the Oxford University Innovations team and find out for custom licensing agreements to get this sorted. They're very open to discussing these things. But if you're working in publicly funded clinical use and research use, then the license is always free. We've done several comparisons to MOCA and MMSE in stroke, showing specifically higher sensitivity and specificity, and mainly also this higher inclusivity for aphasia and neglect. It's being used quite extensively currently across the UK and more in different countries. There's currently 7 existing translations, cultural adaptations of the OCS that have been made, renormed in the specific population of interest and are being used across the world as well. So because we track licensing, we can also figure out how many people are using it. But really it kind of fills that critical need, this brief for assessing domain-specific cognition in a time-efficient way. So now for the final section, I'm just going to walk you through the 10 tasks. So the OCS exists of 10 subtasks, and I'll try and explain briefly why the order is what it is, and what each of these tasks are assessing. And then in a separate session, we'll go into more detail into how to actually do it. So again, here's the overview. Remember these domains: language, attention, memory, praxis, and number. These are the ones that are being assessed. And so it's set up like this. It starts with a picture naming task. It came from the idea that if you were to approach a patient and you would have no idea who they are, you've never met them before, the picture naming is a really nice low threshold task to just say, can I just show you some pictures and see what you think they are? You can then also assess if they have any expressive language. Say you've never met this person before, you can see how much word searching they have to do, but also assesses to some extent object recognition. Then say the patient has absolutely no spoken language and can't make anything clear. The next test is then to understand, okay, do they have receptive language? Do they understand basic instructions? So this test is again under the language domain and is trying to ask, please can you point to the X or to the Y? And it's trying to understand whether people can understand that basic instruction and point, as well as a small level of semantics, moving and abstracting away from specific animals to the higher category. Next, we try and find out what their orientation is like. So assuming, okay, they have language and they can indeed point, or even if they can't, you might still want to try. I have to say at this point, if a patient has been completely unresponsive on the picture naming and on the semantics, they're also completely unresponsive and don't seem to be understanding what you're asking them to do. This is where probably you really want to consider how much of the next series of tasks you might want to do. Often you may stop here if you think they have absolutely no understanding, but sometimes you might want to do one or two more tasks, and I'll highlight them as we go on. But if they pass at least one of these two, you definitely move on to the next section, which is basic orientation in time and space. And this is something that comes up in every single cognitive screen you've ever seen, and is just a very big marker of severe impairment. Are people aware of where they are? Especially, do they know they're in hospital, for example? Do they know whether it's spring or summer or winter? Those kind of very basic questions is the next kind of level of basic functioning to determine. So then next we go on to do a brief visual field test. So it's very simple basic screen holding up the four quadrants simply by moving your hands to understand whether they can point to where they see movement. So it's also in a way a little bit of an instruction comprehension, and you'll find that some people really struggle to, when you say keep your eyes focused on my nose, and they just won't. They'll just keep looking to your hands, and it may be very difficult to test. But so although it's in its prime purpose a basic screen of visual fields, there's always some little extra things you get from quite a lot of these things, and it's within that kind of idea of if you do it yourself, you always observe, and this is something occupational therapy is very good at, and this kind of observing of extra elements and tasks as a whole is very much what we want to do also with the OCS. So once you know whether they have a complete, say, visual field hemianopia or quadrantanopia or none of that, we move on to do a very simple reading task. So if you know they've got a big visual field deficit, you may definitely want to look at the sentence reading, whether they are compensating, even though it's quite centered, and they should be moving their eyes a little bit to the beginning of the sentence. And so this is basically assessing language on the reading little banner wedge in the profile. And then next we go on to do number, which consists of two tasks. One is a writing task where you just give them a few numbers to write down, just in Arabic numbers. And the second one is a calculation task, which they're asked to do very simple sums. And so one sum, one subtraction, one multiplication, and one division. So just 4 items. This can be done multiple choice, so you can get patients with aphasia, for example, to still do calculation. So next, after all that, we do a hearts cancellation task, which is the one I briefly showed you before. And this very much gets at this spatial attention, right? Are they distributing their attention across space? Do they search contralesionally? And we're looking at both object level and space level, or allocentric and egocentric aspects of spatial attention. But in addition, it also really assesses sustained attention. You'll find that some patients don't have a problem with left or right, but just really struggle to sustain their attention to really search through 50 hearts. So you have to, in the end, there's 50 hearts to cross out. But also this kind of executive attention. So much more subtly, but you'll find, for example, the search strategy. Some of our patients will just kind of, hit a target here and there and say, okay, I'm done. So they may not have a neglect, but your heart's cancellation task will show you that actually they seem to have a problem with sustained and executive attention here. On the next level, we then go and do a brief gesture imitation task, which I've shown you before as well. So that's just to briefly assess praxis. And then we get to the recall and recognition task. Oh, I should have said, so when you do the sentence reading, it's also the encoding for the memory task, and we tell them explicitly. So we say, please read the sentence. Then we also read it to them, and we say, remember, I'm going to ask you about this sentence again later on, so please try and remember it. So this is where we get to that. So these tasks that have come in between have been what we would call sandwich tasks. So they're tasks that don't really load anything verbal, but they basically fill that delay period to look at this delayed memory. So it has a verbal and an episodic aspect, and the verbal one is very much cued because you've told them before, I'm going to ask you about the sentence, what do you remember from it? Whereas the incidental memory is not cued, but very much just a few brief questions on which one of these tasks have you done before, what have you seen before, and so it's getting at that non-verbal memory aspect, which is really important to assess, and most assessments only focus on verbal memory, so it's nice to have this one on top, this kind of task recognition, not recall. Okay, and then finally there's a trail making task. This is task 10. So in task 10, this is very much about executive attention and switching. That's the main purpose. So there's a series of baselines where you have to connect one shape, and then in the final one you have to connect two shapes. Again, more detail to follow, but what you have to remember is what this is trying to get at is executive attention, particularly when people have to switch over when you don't have to switch. This extra burden of switching, this extra executive load, how does that affect people, and is there any problems with this extra executive switching? In addition, because we're timing this, it gives you a little bit of an inclination into processing speed. So often, for those familiar with Trails A and Trails B, Trails A is also often used as measures of processing speed, and here you can do similar. You can try and look at that. I'm always a little bit dubious about this because with processing speed, particularly in stroke where they may well have hand-eye coordination deficits and just general slowing and motor deficits, we prefer not to take too much of the speed measures on their own. So you'll find that most of the OCS is all about accuracy rather than speed, but it's still there, so you may get a little bit of information on processing speed. Also, you'll get some information on complex instruction, because although we're specifically looking for the switching element, this is quite a complex task. So you have to figure out and really understand, okay, this is going in this order and it's these shapes and I have to ignore these other shapes. And although we do practice with them, so a demonstration and then a practice and only then the test, it's still a task of complex instruction, and people may fail not because they've got a switching problem, but because they struggle to understand the complex instruction. So that's something to keep in mind. And we'll talk about this again in more depth when we come to interpreting and scoring. But this is just to give you an overview of the 10 tasks and what they're doing. On how to, so we recorded a run-through, a demonstration of a straightforward assessment for one of my research assistants. And it just shows you really how to move about the pages, and it's something that is important in getting used to. So, you know, as with any other test, it's a skill, right? To skillfully present and switch between when you have to show something, when they have to do something, and when you have to write things down and time. So all of those elements are all incorporated, and it's what makes it interactive and more fun, but it's also what makes it need a little bit of training for yourself to get used to the format. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening. There's more information on OCS, and there's more information on our lab and what we do there as well. Thanks very much.